Idealism prevails. Make the world a better place.
Professor Mangott, it's a pleasure again to see you after such a long break. Thank you very much for having me and having the time to have this conversation.
Hello, Mr. Penkin. Good to be back.
So, as already said, many things have changed since we last spoke, and not in a positive direction, regrettably. So we now have a full-time war, a full-scale war between Russia and Ukraine, which no one expected and nobody thought would happen, including both of us, since it was us who spoke a year and a half ago, arguing whether there could be a real conflict or not, and we both agreed that there is no ground for that. And in 2014, Russia meddled into Ukraine, and I must stress, a purely Ukraine uprising against the manifestly pro-Russian president Viktor Yanukovych. And back then, Russian military and political forces were acting relatively undercover, if this term can be applied to this even. So what changed? What's the main difference between this conflict that happens in 2022 and the one that began in 2014? Why did Vladimir Putin suddenly decide to change his strategy?
Well, there's a great discussion about why, and some observers, journalists, politicians, and academics alike think that it had already been clear in 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, that Russia would finally wage an all-out war against Ukraine. So they think that there's a direct connection between 2014 and 2022. I don't think so. When Putin was elected as president of Russia in 2000, he was a very different person with a very different worldview. So to argue Putin already then should have been identified as a great power imperialist, as a historical revisionist, is actually wrong. And I even argue that after the events in 2014 and the following years, there was no direct line from those events to the attack of Russia on Ukraine that started in February. We had quite a lot of chances over the past 22 years to establish different relations between the West and Russia. And many things happened which did not actually encourage either side to engage with the other side, to invest time, money, and resources in establishing good relations. And in the academic field, I think we need, after a short pause, because currently emotions are dominating the discourse, in the academic field, we need to look why, how, and when did mistakes happen on both sides. Well, coming back to Ukraine, I'd say that Vladimir Putin actually believed that the implementation of the Minsk agreement from February 2015 would allow him to establish major control, at least over Ukraine's foreign policy. At least this is what he expected when in that Minsk agreement it was stated that the separatist regions in the Donbass will have a veto power, or a major say to be precise, in Ukrainian politics. So Putin clearly expected by this agreement and by this very article, he would be able to influence Ukrainian politics and policy. As it turned out, the Ukrainian side did not implement its political obligations under the Minsk Agreement. The Minsk Agreement consists of two parts: a military part, which endorses a comprehensive and sustainable ceasefire, the exchange of war prisoners on the basis of the principle all for all, and the withdrawal of heavy weaponry from a security zone 50 kilometers on both sides of the line of confrontation. But there's also a political dimension of the Minsk Agreement. And here, Ukraine promised that it would first pass a law of amnesty on the fighters in the Donbass. It also promised that it would change its constitution to decentralize Ukraine. And it also promised that it would adopt a law on the special status of the separatist regions. Kiev has not implemented any of these promises. And it would have been impossible, even if Poroshenko or the current President Zelensky would have wanted to, because there's simply no political majority for such far-reaching measures in Ukraine, has not been for all the years since 2015. But in 2021, at the beginning of 2021, Zelensky started to put in question the whole agreement, the Minsk Agreement. He argued that this agreement from February 2015 had been imposed on Ukraine during a moment of political and military weakness. And Ukraine should not be expected any longer to implement it. And so for the Russian side now, it was clear that the Minsk process was at a dead end, and that Moscow's ambitions to keep control over Ukraine via the implemented Minsk Agreement had failed. I think was the reason why Putin finally decided to launch an all-out war against Ukraine. Something, as you've correctly said, we had not expected and did not consider possible 1.5 years ago.
I was following your words regarding the perspective of so-called Western states, which is of course it's like a framework term. So if not, well, we of course consider Russia an indisputable aggressor in this conflict, and there were still maybe some steps that those Western states poorly considered before, which could maybe kind of push Russia towards some decisions. I'm not speaking about the word directly, but in this case, I'm just pointing on some whoever ball in the court is at the moment. So where were the policies of Western states naive regarding Russian leadership, where maybe they there were some misleading signals that they could have sent either to Ukraine or to Russia?
Well, when President Putin and President Biden met in June of 2021, maybe Putin got the impression that Biden was indeed clearly interested in establishing what Biden called a stable and predictable relationship between the two nations. So maybe he misinterpreted the meaning of the summit and Biden's words and thought to himself, well, maybe the West would not react too strongly if we go after Ukraine. May well be. But we need to take into account that already in March, April last year, they had the first troop mobilization of Russia at the borders of Ukraine. And already then some were expecting a major offensive of Russia's military against Ukraine. At that time, in various interviews, I said, no, it was just a red line. put in the sand by Putin. A red line for Zelensky, who, as I've argued, stopped accepting the Minsk agreement and was going after Russian interests in Ukraine, and to the United States, to Biden, not to continue with intensifying the military cooperation between Ukraine and the United States and other NATO countries. Maybe Putin also, this is a different interpretation, considered the fact the summit meeting was possible after that would mean that the United States would actually try to push Ukraine or Zelensky to go ahead with the implementation of the Minsk agreement. So two possible interpretations how Putin responded to the summit. But it became clear in the fall that Putin's expectations actually had been untrue, particularly the second interpretation that the United States would accept Russia's red line and push Ukraine, as I've said, towards cooperating with Russia. And that's when the second troop mobilization started. And in December of last year, the Russian leadership demanded from both the United States and NATO in two draft treaties to provide legally binding security guarantees for Russia. They demanded that NATO should revoke its membership promise to Ukraine, which NATO had given Ukraine in April 2008. They also demanded that NATO forces and their infrastructure should be removed from the territory of the eastern flank of NATO. And they also asked for some other concessions, the major one being no more enlargement of NATO. Not only no more enlargement to the east, but as in the draft treaty with NATO, Russians demanded that NATO should no longer expand anymore. And they asked for negotiations with the Western side, but the West immediately declared the core Russian demands as non-starters, as non-negotiable. And I understand the Western position to a certain extent, but I'm not sure, though I have no evidence, if through intensive negotiations, the decision of Putin to invade Ukraine could have been prevented, particularly in regard to a possible neutral status of Ukraine. I have no evidence that this would have worked. Maybe it would have not have worked, but the West should have given it a try, because then Putin no longer could argue that he is invading Ukraine because it is a basis for a Western assault on the security of the Russian Federation. So unfortunately, I think this initiative to talk about about a neutral status for Ukraine, this effort was not sincerely made. But then again, I have to stress, I don't know whether Putin had already decided to invade Ukraine even before the talks with the West started at the end of December 2021. Maybe the whole initiative to negotiate about the draft treaties was just a trick by the Russian side to blame the West for what happened next, blame him for not having accepted Moscow's demands. So actually we don't know, and there will be much more time needed. It will be for the historians to find out in the archival documents what really was debated and discussed and talked about between the West and Russia from December to February of last year and this year. But at the end of the day, I'm realistic and understand that NATO membership or rapprochement between NATO and Ukraine was not the sole, maybe not the decisive reason for Vladimir Putin to launch this war of aggression. Putin is a historical revisionist, very much influenced by 19th and 20th century philosophers and writers particularly by Leontief, Gumilyov in Ilyin. And he's definitely convinced that Ukraine must not exist as a separate state outside Russian control. So this historically motivated and argued imperialistic logic of Vladimir Putin's presidency also was a major reason why the invasion in Ukraine happened. So it's not just about NATO. It's not about NATO, as some in the West now argue, but it's definitely more than just a NATO issue. It was this position of Putin not to recognize Ukraine as an independent state and Ukrainians as an independent people. And the NATO issue, of course, does not in any sense legitimate Russia's aggression. This war of aggression is illegal and illegitimate and cannot be argued for by any argument that the Russian side has provided.
Apart from this, how else, which other consequences, maybe some practical consequences, could this conflict put in those relationships between US and Russia particularly? So what are we looking at within the further, let's say, 10 to 20 years of relationship between them?
Well, if you look so far into the future, Putin will be no longer president of Russia. Well, theoretically, he could remain president till 2036 if he stays alive and is getting re-elected in 2024 and 2030, at least with Russian elections. But I don't think we will see Putin till that very year. But I don't think that there will be any rapprochement between the United States and Russia, also not with between the European Union and Russia, as long as Vladimir Putin stays in power. I cannot think of Putin ever again visiting a Western country. So for the West, it's clear with this president, with Vladimir Putin, there's no way of engaging. So this will, Putin and the length of his term in power will definitely be the crucial factor for how relations between the West and Russia will develop. But even if Putin's gone, we need to wait who is going to be his successor. Will we see Putinism without Putin? The same revanchist, revisionist foreign policy, the imperialist aims that Putin is endorsing, if the successor will also stick to this line, or if we will have someone who, like Gorbachev, would be a politician, a Russian leader, trying to re-engage with the West and mend ties and re-establish good relations. But that's a very long time away. The Defense Secretary of the United States in April, Mr. Austin, said that the US aim in this war against Ukraine is not only to help Ukraine win, but to weaken Russia to an extent that Russia in the foreseeable future will no longer be able to start a similar war against another neighboring country. So it's clear for the United States the strategic weakening of the Russian Federation is the core goal to be achieved. And this also makes the United States actually the major geopolitical winner of the current disastrous war. They can downgrade, they can weaken a peer competitor, Russia, without using a single US soldier. That's not necessary. But by fighting this proxy war, as the New York Times put it today, Russia will emerge from this war as a very weakened country. And that's the fault of the Russian leadership, as I do think that launching this offensive against Ukraine is a strategic failure or a strategic mistake of the Russian leadership. But it seems that Putin's geopolitical ambitions are more important for him than the economic, financial, and social well-being of the Russian Federation.
It was very well said about the weakening of Russia. Even though I'm convinced that the Russian leadership is not thinking the same way. They actually suppose that launching the campaign and waging this war is basically a matter of putting yourself, at least a full an appearance of being a stronger, of having an upper hand, of being a stronger player on the stage. But before that, you mentioned Mikhail Gorbachev, who recently, a couple of days ago, passed away, being 21 years old. It's
91 precise.
91, yes, 91, exactly.
Not 21.
Oh, yes, this is probably my mistake. Yeah, not this young. At least he was not this young when a picture was taken of him standing in New York with two ex-presidents of the United States, President Bush, the senior, and President Reagan back then. This photo became quite viral these days. You also mentioned the fact that you don't think that Russian leader would step on the American soil in the near future, especially if we're considering Putin to stay in this role. You were talking about the sanctions before. You were talking about the sanctions that were in place before the beginning of this war. Now we have many more stricter options against Russia, including the visa ban. Still, individual sanctions against specific persons in Russia are not completely in state, even though some of them were undertaken. So, what do you think about this new wave of sanctions of the West?
Well, I think that sanctions actually were unavoidable. The West needed to impose sanctions on Russia because this is a brutal violation of international law and something Europe has not seen since 1945. The question is, which effect did the sanctions or have the sanctions so far had? Well, definitely a punishing effect on Russia's economy and the financial sector. Despite the fact that the Russian GDP will not decline as steeply as had been expected in the spring. So the International Monetary Fund expects the Russian economy to shrink by 6% this year. And previously, estimates had it between 12 and 15%. So even if the Russian economy only shrinks by 6% this year, this is also a major recession for the Russian side. And the sanctions already in the short term have had an impact on Russia. More than 1,000 Western companies have left Russia. The Russian ruble got under serious pressure, devalued strongly in the first days of the war, and only through the imposition of capital controls, the external value of the ruble has been strengthened over the past months. People don't have the chance to buy many Western products they used to buy, particularly the middle class and the upper class in Russia. And so in the short term, we already had consequences, but in the mid to long term, we will have much more serious economical and financial effects introduced by the EU sanctions and the US sanctions and sanctions of other Western countries, particularly the decision by the West to prohibit the export of certain technologies to the Russian Federation, particularly in the electronic sector, no longer selling chips to the Russian side. And this actually will have a very, very disastrous impact on Russia's economy, because many products produced in Russia, both in the civilian and in the military sector, use Western components. And now the Russian industry is lacking these components. And this will mean that if it cannot substitute Western deliveries by deliveries from China or any other country, whole branches of Russia's industry will stop production, or at least will have to lower the production levels they had before the war started. So it will have a punishing effect, all these sanctions by the West. It also, of course, has a signaling effect, demonstrating and showing and telling the Russians that what they do in Ukraine is unacceptable. And what we also can see is a constraining effect, only in the long term, however. Constrainment means that by sanctions, you try to weaken a country to the extent that it is no longer able to conduct an aggressive, even militaristic foreign policy. In the long run, we will see such constrainment effects, that's true, but that's only in the long run, not in the short to medium-term future, so it will not have an impact on the Ukrainian war and the course of the Ukrainian war. What the sanctions have not achieved, though, is what many consider the most important and relevant effect of sanctions, namely the behavioral change of the sanctioned state, namely that sanctions push the sanctioned state to change its foreign policy behavior. This would mean that Russia would stop its war in Ukraine. But I don't think that even if the European Union adopts an 8th, a 9th, or a 10th sanctions package, Putin will actually alter his course. Putin will not end this war with whatever sanctions the West can still impose. And this is because geopolitics is at the heart of Putin's foreign policy. And in these geopolitical ambitions, Ukraine needs to be part of Russia's orbit, if not even part of the Russian Federation.
On the other side, Russia is basically waging another proxy war against the West by launching an energy crisis, a worldwide energy crisis, I must say. And it's being one of the consequences of the war. Could you probably comment on the matter of where does Europe stands at this moment in relation to the gas and oil imports, as they deliberately cut their imports from Russia? And this evening, I read from your Twitter just before our interview that Gazprom has made it public that they are decreasing their gas production by approximately 15%. So, what about the European energetic independence? Is it possible? Is it where are we at the moment? Where should we go? Where the price? I mean, of course, the prices are going up, but is there any silver lining in all that?
Well, in 2021, Russian gas exports to Europe made up 41% of all gas imports of the European Union. That has changed markedly after the war broke out in February, and most countries decided to wean themselves off the energy dependence on the Russian Federation. The EU has imposed an import ban on coal, which entered into force at the beginning of August. In early December of this year, Russian oil exports by tanker will be prohibited, so no more Russian oil can be sold on the EU market, which is shipped by tanker. Only pipeline exports will still be possible for Russia, particularly because countries like Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic have stated in Brussels that they cannot wean themselves off from Russian oil imports as quickly as the EU Commission had wanted the EU to do. There are no gas sanctions against Russia. And some Russia supporters argue that we would not have gas deliveries by Russia cut by 72% if we compare July the 31st of this year with July the 31st of 2021, if the West had not imposed sanctions on Russia. Well, this is not really true, because the Russian side already back in 2021 started to deliver less gas to its EU partner countries than they had done previously. It maybe was a signal to the EU that Russia is actually ready to stop all gas deliveries to the European Union if the European Union goes after Russia in the case of Russia would start a war of aggression against Ukraine. So we already had less gas available from Russia in the past year. Since the start of the war and EU sanctions, Russia has further cut gas deliveries to the European Union. The Yamal-Europe pipeline is no longer operational because the Russian state has imposed sanctions on the Polish section of this pipeline, so no gas transports via this pipeline. Nord Stream 2, as a consequence of Russia's war, will not be certified, maybe forever, at least not for the foreseeable future. And the Russians have cut supplies via Nord Stream 1 by 80%. Since July, only 20% of the capacity of this pipeline is used by Russia. Well, if sanctions have made Russia decide to lower the gas exports to Europe, we need to stress that Gazprom's decision, and it means the Russian state's decision to weaken the European gas market, to push up the prices, had already started before the war. At the same time, it is true, of course, what Russia has done with gas deliveries after the war broke out is indeed also an answer to the sanctions by the European Union. So I think it's wrong when Western journalists or politicians argue that the sanctions have no harsh effect on Western economies. Sanctions always hurt both sides of the relationship, the sanctioner and the sanctioned state. So we have a drop in exports to Russia, of course. But sanctions, the EU has adopted on Russia not only hurt us by the consequences of the content of the sanctions, but the sanctions of the European Union hurt our economies because Russia has decided to use energy to blackmail the European Union. And we have all seen how the prices for gas and power developed in the European Union over the past months. So indeed, Western sanctions have indirectly caused the current energy crisis because Russia uses the weapon at its disposal to hurt the European Union because of their sanctions against the Russian Federation. Well, many countries, as I've said, had tried to wean them off from Russian gas as quickly as possible, and Germany was the most important business partner of Gazprom in the European Union for many years. Now Germany has started to buy gas from other countries, particularly from Norway and the Netherlands, and from some other countries. It has started to save gas by energy-saving measures, but it will not be able to come through this coming winter without soaring gas prices or even a lack of gas if the Russians will fully stop gas deliveries to Germany or other EU countries. So the Russian decision to stop all gas exports would mean a very heavy burden for many European economies, particularly for Germany and Austria. And everybody's expecting a recession, at least a technical recession in Germany, if the gas delivery problems continue, or if Russia stops all gas deliveries to Germany. So it has a major impact on EU economies, at least on some EU economies. And there is, of course, a clear political aim behind the Russian state's decision to supply much less gas to the EU. The expectation is that the populations in Europe, particularly the German population, would actually turn against their own government when they can no longer pay for their energy bills, or if they have to ration power, or if they don't get as much gas as needed. So what Putin is trying by this gas blockade, or almost gas blockade, is to mobilize the population's opposition to governmental policies which try to assist and help Ukraine defend itself against Russian aggression, and will mobilize European populations against the government with regard to the sanctions they had imposed on Russia in the past 6.5 months. So there's a clear message to people afraid of no longer being able to pay their bills, afraid of losing the job because their energy-intensive industrial branch no longer gets as much gas as it is needed, will turn against this pro-Ukrainian positions of Western governments, particularly European governments. So clearly, Russia has imposed its sanctions on us as well, trying to have a clear shock effect on the European Union, and to maybe change the EU policy vis-à-vis Ukraine and Russia due to popular rebellion or resistance in some EU countries.
Do you think it's by any rate possible that this can be the case within those European countries, turning up the population against their governments? Do you think it's possible in, let's say, Austria, for instance?
It's quite likely that we see this solidarity with Ukraine decrease among the populations of some EU countries, definitely. What I do not see, however, is, and that of course is the ultimate ambition of Russia's gas sanctions on the European Union, what I do not see is that European governments will change their stance on Ukraine and Russia, even if there is popular resistance to a Ukraine-friendly foreign policy and a Ukraine-friendly and anti-Russian course. So I don't see any country in Europe, except for Hungary, where governments will actually give in to popular protests against high gas prices, high energy prices, which they consider to be a consequence of the Western sanctions on Russia. I don't see that. And the foreign minister of Germany, Annalena Baerbock, today stressed precisely this position. She said she will stick to her promise to aid Ukraine as long as Ukraine needs help and assistance, even if her German voters reject it, even if her German voters would suffer economically and financially. So you see, at least she is very much committed to continue the pro-Ukraine stance at any cost. And I think no one in the German government actually, including of course the Chancellor Olaf Scholz, is actually thinking otherwise. They would not state it this bluntly. They wouldn't be so frank and open. But I think the Russian ambition to expect policy changes by European governments as a consequence of popular rebellions against prices in the energy sector will work out.
We could speak about the energy problems for as much as we would like. It would last forever. You know, both of us, we specialize in this area, so it's a matter of interest of both of us. But if draw our attention towards something that we actually never discussed before, something more emotional, as much as we can speak about emotional part of all this, and maybe even psychological. So any conflict has an impact on further relations between the countries and further mentality of a nation. So, you know, there are many opinions on different sides. Opinions are pro-Ukrainian, opinions can be pro-Russian. But what do you think will be, again, in the long run, a psychological effect on a mentality of, let's say, Russia and Ukraine, of the amenity between them?
Well, I think ties between Ukraine and Russia will be destroyed for at least this generation. More realistically, however, it will have a negative impact on bilateral ties for many generations, even if a new leader in Russia changes the Russian policy on Ukraine and withdraws all forces from Ukrainian territory that Russian armed forces have conquered since February of this year. The Russians have also strengthened the sense of Ukrainian statehood. They have actually strengthened Ukrainian national identity. So what had been quite a problem for a while in Ukraine, a societal cohesion, endorsing the idea of an ethnically Ukrainian nation, has now been established due to the war launched by Putin against the Ukraine. So I don't see any chance for any normalization of relations as long as Putin is in power. And maybe it will take even longer, even after Vladimir Putin, until there will be normal, not necessarily friendly, but normal relations between Russia and Ukraine, and Russians and Ukrainians. How this will impact on the Russian society is difficult to argue. According to the Levada Center in Moscow, a majority of Russians is backing what the Russians call a special military operation. It's difficult to understand if opinion polling is a valid instrument in a repressive political system as Russia's. But the sociologists at that Moscow Institute argue that indeed there is a majority backing this special military operation for various reasons. There are, of course, people who really share Putin's aims and ambitions and endorse military action. Others have been apathetic and have politically resigned for many years already. And well, they see now there is a war. The leadership has decided to wage such a war, and well, let it be. Is most likely their attitude towards the fighting. And then we have a certain segment of Russia's population who actually does not really believe that Russia had no other alternative but to start this invasion of Ukraine. But I think maybe Putin knows something we don't know. Maybe he knows what is important for our country's security. Even if we don't understand it, we can assume that he does. And of course, acts according to what he sees as his responsibility to protect the security of the Russian state. And then we have a minority which is clearly opposed to the war, particularly the middle class and the upper class. The more well-off, well-educated, younger, urban Russians are opposed to this war, most of them at least. But the repression in Russia is so strong that we have not seen major public expressions of opposition over the past 6 months. Yes, initially we had some protests, but at that time, 15,000 demonstrators were arrested by the Russian police. Many have been put in jail, have lost their study places at Russian universities. Some have lost their jobs. And the Russian parliament has endorsed or passed a law which can bring a Russian citizen who allegedly discredits the Russian armed forces into jail for 15 years. And many of those who oppose the war, particularly the young, highly qualified people, have left Russia over the past 6 months because they want to flee Russia, afraid of being persecuted by the government. They don't want to live in a country with a high degree of repressive control by the state. Or they no longer think that they have a career perspective and a chance for prosperity in a sanctioned country like Russia will be over the next many years, I think. And so what we have seen is that we have had a major brain drain in Russia, particularly of people who oppose the war. There's almost no opposition anymore in Russia. Many opposition politicians have fled the country, have been forced into exile, or are in jail, as Alexei Navalny, of course. So I don't see that this camp will have any chance to express its opposition to this war, even if Russia would lose the war against Ukraine. So the state adding new repressive measures will force on the Russian people the support for the state's actions against Ukraine. And this will have not just the negative impact of qualified Russians leaving Russia, but this will, I guess, also have the impact that more and more Russians want to stay out of politics altogether, simply want to live their private lives and go on. And actually, I think that that's also visible in Putin's strategy. Why he has not launched a general mobilization in Russia, drafting the reservists that the Russian armed forces have, between 1.5 and 2 million people. He has not done so, as I think, because mobilizing so many people would actually open up the eyes of many Russians. They would realize, yes, we are a country at war, not in a special military operation, but we are at war, and the war costs us dearly, not just due to the sanctions, but to the many men, brothers, uncles who have died in Ukraine trying to conquer that country, or at least part of it. So I think Putin is avoiding general mobilization to keep society calm, to not let society feel that the country is at war. And it seems that so far he has been quite successful. But on the other hand, you as a Russian are more qualified to talk about this than I am.
I agree with your words here. If I were to add something to them, I would say that, in my opinion, one of the main principles of Russian political play is to keep the population as indifferent as possible, as far from the decision making as possible. Probably make it look as difficult, impossible, practically impossible, so that the ordinary people would just give up on their right to have any word in this area. Mobilization means that the government actually opens your door, enters your room, puts the men away, takes away, and then put them in the uniform and take somewhere else. So this is the matter of this private life. The real side for myself, and the sad side of all that, is that that mostly Russians don't have any faith in their capacity as a united people. Well, which actually compromises the name of the united Russia. It is just the opposite, and this is the main trick that Vladimir Putin has been playing over the last 20 years, I'd say, while giving something very theoretical in return. For my side, I would say that I never, since the war started, explicitly stated my thoughts on war publicly, apart from couple of times, because I thought that would draw attention from what is happening in Ukraine, because the situation there is much worse. The people are suffering greater things that me, my environment, my family had to go through the past months. But I know for the fact that you have been also impacted by this war. So you being a scientist, a professional scientist, being in the world of academia for at least 30, 40 years, 30 years for sure.
Approximately 40, unfortunately.
Yes, approaching. But still, I know that the amount of your followers have tripled within the last months. But still, you're drawing a lot of criticism, both from pro-Russian and from pro-Ukrainian side, by trying to stay neutral for as much as possible, despite all the atrocities that Russian soldiers are undertaking on the Ukrainian soil. What do you think? And despite all that, the science, as the media perspective of science at least, has started picking sides since the beginning of war. So where do you stand in this? Should the scientists actually be pro something or anti something else?
Well, I had a very high media exposure over the past 6 months. Till now, I have given more than 560 interviews, starting from January the 1st. And if you are so present on national and international media, you do, of course, have a great responsibility to really think carefully and thoroughly about what you say, how you comment, how you position yourself in this conflict. But already before the war, I understood my position as a political analyst as requiring more or less the look at events from the outside or from above in a most objective manner. I never wanted to engage as an activist. That's the job of politicians. That's the job of NGOs. It should not be the job of journalists. Many journalists seem to have forgotten about that. But I don't think that science should actually take sides in a conflict openly. We all have our private opinions, and I do have a very strong opinion on who is the aggressor and who is the victim. So I do have a strong opinion, but this opinion I have as a private citizen, as an analyst. No, I don't want to take sides. I want to report what's going on, explaining why probably it's going on, and to explain what scenarios for the future I think of. That's my job. Well, the fact that I'm criticized on social media, particularly with emails, that I'm either pro-Russian or pro-Ukrainian, is sort of an evidence for me that I do the right job. Both sides, both camps, both parties are not actually liking what I say, what I do. So once again, I do have a very strong private opinion. I do have a moral position on what's going on, but this is something just for me, for my private life. It's not part of my job description. It's not part of how I understand my job as a media savvy analyst.
Idealism prevails. Make the world a better place.